upon a time in a land far away and long ago, there lived a princess who never cried. She never cried because there was no reason for her to ever cry. Her father, the king, gave her everything she ever asked for. Except one day, she comes into the throne room and she tells her father, "I would like to see God." He says, "Excuse me?" She crosses her arms, stomps her foot, and says, "Yes, you've always given me everything I want. Right now, what I want is I want to see God." And so, being the ever-indulgent king, the ever-indulgent father, he says, "Well, give me a couple days, I'll see what I can do." So he calls all of his advisors into him, and he tells them his predicament. Says, "My little girl wants to see God. I have no idea what to do. What can you do to help me?" Well, the chief of law and order steps forward and says, "Your Majesty, if I may, I think perhaps I can help you. Send the princess to me tomorrow, and I will see if I can show her God." And so the next day, the princess comes to the chief of law and order. He takes her to a part of the castle she's never been to before. Up a long and winding staircase, he takes out this huge copper key, puts it in the door, and unlocks it. And as they walk in, it's a giant room with just one table, and on the table is the biggest book this little girl has ever seen in her life. And he says, "Your Majesty, what you see here is the book of law and order for our kingdom. This book rules the lives of our people. It tells them what to do. It tells them what they must not do. It tells them the punishment for if they do disobey. This book is like God to our people." Well, the princess once again crosses her arms, looks at the book, sniffs, turns around, and stomps out, saying, "That dirty old book isn't God." The next day, the chief of the treasury comes to the king and says, "Perhaps, sir, I can help. Perhaps, Your Majesty, I can help. May I speak with the princess?" And so the princess comes out once again, meets the chief of the treasury, and you know where he's going to take her. He takes her to another part of the castle, a part of the castle she's never been before, down this time, along a winding staircase. Again, a big copper key, puts it in the lock, opens the door. When he opens the door, she looks and she sees more treasures, more riches than she could have ever imagined, more than she's ever seen in all of her life. And she's grown up in the castle, keep in mind. The chief of the treasury tells her, "Princess, this is the treasure of our kingdom. There's more wealth here than you can ever imagine. With this money, with these precious things, you can buy anything you could ever want. This money has the power of God." And again, the princess crosses her arms, sniffs again, turns on her heels, and says, "That's dirty old money, isn't God?" Well, at this point, you can imagine the king's getting frustrated. He didn't know what to do. So he decides, "I'm going to go out. I'm going to find God for myself." He looked all through the castle and couldn't find God. Wasn't quite sure what he was looking for. And finally, he begins to search outside the castle walls. He looked all day, the next day, the day after that, but still is no closer to finding God that will satisfy the wants and desires of his daughter. And so finally, he sits down exhausted on a rock. And as he's sitting there, he sees this old man, very old man, in his 80s, maybe even 90s, planting a brand new fruit tree. The king looks at the old man and says, "Sir, surely you don't expect to get any fruit from that new fruit tree." The old man says, "Well, probably not, Your Majesty, but my kids might, and my grandkids certainly will, God willing." The king says, "God? You know God? Do you know where I might be able to find God?" Well, he said, I've met God. Yes, I think I might help you. He says, "My limit is my daughter wants to see God. I don't know how to show her God." The old man says, "I'm not sure if I can help, but tomorrow if I could have audience with your daughter, maybe I can help. I'll see what I can do." So the next day, again, the princess comes out, somewhat impatient at this time. She walks up to the old man, who is not nobility, he's not one of the advisors, and says, "So I suppose you're going to show me God?" He says, "Well, we'll see. I'm not sure, but there is someone I would like for you to meet if you'll come with me." And so the old man takes the little girl outside of the castle into the village that is adjacent to the castle, to the other side of the village, to a small cottage. And he sits down on a stump outside the cottage, and he says, "Princess, I would like you to go in, and I would like you to meet the person who lives in this cottage. When you're finished meeting this person, come out, and we'll talk." "All right," the princess said. And she went through the door into this one-room cottage, and found waiting in this little cottage in the middle of that one room a little girl about her own age who looked up at the princess and smiled. But the princess didn't smile back, being as impatient as she is at this point. The smile had disappeared from her face, and she said, "When you're in the presence of majesty, you rise to greet majesty." At this point, the smile left the little girl's face, and she pulls the blanket off to show legs that are shriveled and not working. And she says, "I'm so sorry, Your Majesty, I cannot rise, I cannot stand." The princess was in there for a long time. She finally comes out, and she walks past the old man, and she walks right past him, a brisk walk, walking down the road back towards the castle. The old man struggles, catches up with her, and says, "Your Majesty, are you ready?" She says, "Ready? Ready for what?" He said, "I think surely now you must be ready." And he reached into his bag, and he pulled out a mirror and held it in front of her face, up in front of the face of the princess who never cried. And she saw in the reflection tears coming down her face, just uncontrollable tears that were coming down. She looked up at the old man and said, "I didn't know people lived like that. I didn't know there were little girls my age who had so little, and I wonder what I can do maybe to help out in some way. Can we bring her a pot of soup maybe, or maybe a new dress would help, always helps me, or maybe my father's doctors, they can come and they can do something to help her walk again, or what can we do to help her? Is there anything?" At this point, the old man looks at her with a smile, and he says to the princess who had never cried before this moment, "Your Majesty, you can't see the greatness of God. This side of heaven, none of us are allowed to see the greatness of God. But today we've seen the next best thing, because at least now you're able to see through the eyes of God, and you're able to see people the way God sees people. You're able to see the world the way God sees the world." From our gospel reading this morning, on the surface is a very simple story of physical blindness of a beggar who's cowering under a ragged mound of burlap. Probably as Jesus and the disciples were walking that day, the only evidence that there was really a human under there was this filthy hand that was reaching out, asking for some money, asking for some kind of alms. And this story proceeds much as we would expect it to do. This story in the gospel is fit in the Gospel of Mark, what we call travel narratives. That for the last 3-4 chapters of Mark, Jesus and the disciples have been traveling from place to place. And so in this part of the travel narratives, the disciples have to have compassion fatigue. And I think some of us have suffered from that before. We do everything we can to meet the needs of those around us. It seems the harder we try, the more needs that we are exposed to. And so there's just that compassion fatigue. We can't meet all the needs no matter what we want. This day, all the disciples want is to pass by without having to look at this man, the sorry state that he's found himself. They've seen it before, it's just one more beggar by the side of the road. Besides, convenience is saying this is not a good time to stop. It's 17 miles from Jericho up to Jerusalem. The day is going to be hot soon. The road, what they call the Jericho road from Jericho to Jerusalem, 17 miles, it elevates 3,000 miles between these two cities. 3,000 miles within, or 3,000 feet, within 17 miles. Narrow, twisted, littered with rock, crevices everywhere, a lot of places for bandits to ambush someone who's traveling. The disciples try to silence the beggar's shout. Jesus stops, listens, and restores the sight. It's really a wonderful story, a wonderful healing story. It's a miracle. But if you've ever read through many of the gospel stories, you have to know that there's always a second level. There's what you see on the surface, and it's there, it's true, there's application, but there's also something just below the surface. When you read in the Gospel of John and also the Gospel of Matthew about the healing of blind Bartimaeus, Jesus gives commentary and says that it's not only about physical blindness, but it's also about spiritual blindness. And the story, Jesus' commentary, is how he opens not only physical eyes, but also opens the spiritual eyes of Bartimaeus. Bartimaeus, who now is healed, follows Jesus from Jericho up to Jerusalem, a new relationship with God. But again, there's more to the story. On the one hand, this is a story about meeting the needs of the people that we meet, that God puts in our lives. About meeting either the physical needs, or it's also a great text about evangelism. That we go out, we've got this great message from God, and so we need to go out and we need to share that message with everyone else. One of the great stories that was coming back from the missionaries who were able to go back into China after the Cultural Revolution. Some of the medical missionaries told the story one time about this man who had come to the clinic. He had severe cataracts. They were able to operate, and his sight was restored. The next day, this man came back to the clinic, except he came back with 10 friends who were also blind. That's a great example of evangelism. But evangelism isn't something that we do, not some program that we've developed. But evangelism is basically a beggar telling other beggars where to find bread. It's a pretty easy model, of course, to follow. But on this second level, this story was not written down immediately when it happens. It's years later that Mark comes together with the help of Peter, and they begin to write down the stories of Jesus that they remember, the stories that are going to have impact. Because at this point, we're getting further and further away from those eyewitnesses' accounts of Jesus. And the church needs that memory. The church needs those stories. The church needs that encouragement. At the time that Mark was writing his gospel, he's writing to Christians who were meeting in Rome. Some of those Christians at the time that Mark was writing his gospel were literally being thrown to the lions. Literally in the gladiatorial games, they were losing their lives at the whims of an emperor who was losing his mind. A few years after the writing of Mark's gospel, Nero was going to burn a portion of Rome, and then in his civic rebuilding program, he's got to find someone to blame. And so he finds the Christians who are unrepresented in a very large city. So he can blame them, and the persecution breaks out again. When Peter and Mark and the others get together, in hindsight, they began to recount this story. And they began to realize, now we're seeing this story with eyes that we didn't have back when the story originally happened. When they first saw this story, they saw it with eyes that had not yet seen the resurrected Jesus, but now they come together again, and they ask the question, who is the blind one in this story? Surely this church needed to know that a God that would hear the cries and remove the cataracts from the eyes of the blind man is the same God that's going to hear the cries of the church in whatever time, whatever age, whatever geography. God will hear those cries, and God will answer. On a Reformation Sunday, it's a great text to remember that throughout the ages, the church has come together and there's been forces pushing against the church. And there's times that, like the beggar, we just want to wrap ourselves in a shawl, retreat to some area, and just hope we can survive. Jesus opens the eyes and says, don't be afraid. The fear that wraps itself around the heart of the church today is not a mere children's Halloween game of ghosts and goblins and monsters. Sometimes our fear is very real, even justified. There's war, there's poverty, there's hunger, there's disaster that invades our living room daily through television, newspaper, or Google, whatever it is your fancy. Racism, sexism, ageism run amok in this land of the free. Violence stalks our street, of course, into our neighborhoods. And it's very easy, in the face of such terror, it'd be very easy for the church just to gather together, close the fear around us, and huddle inside our walls, and never come out. And while we sit here, wrapped up, blinded by fear, that's the point where God walks by. Just as Jesus walked past a blind Bartimaeus so long ago, the living God walks past our human experiences today. And if we listen very carefully, we're going to hear the same thing God asking of us that he asked of Bartimaeus. What do you want me to do for you? What do you want me to do for you? Ask in my name, and it will be done. The good news of the gospel is that the church that wishes to be seen will be given a new vision. Not the vision that we see here, but once the cataracts are lifted, we're able to see with the eyes of God. We're able to see the vision that Jesus infused us with. I don't know how many of you years ago saw that remarkable picture taken from the lens of the Hubble telescope. It photographed these two galaxies colliding together. And what you expected to see when two galaxies collide, you expect to see mass destruction. But everyone was amazed with these two galaxies colliding, amazed to see stars being born. Only the Creator God could imagine such a thing, that there's no end in all creation to what we might see. And through the eyes of faith, I hope you can have that belief that the church is like that. That through the eyes of God, there's no end to what the church will be and can be. Amen.